My job is to follow two very comprehensive presentations, one on new and innovative approaches to fisheries management, and another one equally difficult to follow that laid out a lot of the experiences of the Great Barrier Reef, many of which have been translated into a broader concept called marine spatial planning, and that's really what I want to talk about so that you go away from this presentation with some idea about what marine spatial planning is, where it's being applied, and how it might even be applied to the Costa Rican concept or context. First of all, what is marine spatial planning? It's a very confusing term. There are a lot of different definitions, many of them quite vague. So I really want to try and make it a little bit more operational, both in terms of a definition, and assure you that this is no longer an academic concept, that there are many places that are in fact implementing marine spatial planning today. This definition was developed through a consensus process of a number of practitioners and marine scientists about 6 years ago at a meeting at UNESCO in Paris. And I want to just emphasize a couple parts of the definition. Marine spatial planning is a public process. That's important to recognize. It's not about making decisions from an industry standpoint or from a non-governmental standpoint or even from a governmental standpoint alone. It is a transparent public process that is comprised of analyzing and, most importantly, allocating spatial and temporal distributions of human activities. As John said, we don't manage environmental components, we don't manage fish, we don't manage where oil and gas is located. We manage the human activities that actually use those kinds of resources. And the purpose is to achieve very specific environmental, economic, or social objectives, which are defined, again, not through technocrats or bureaucrats, but through a public process that involves stakeholders in terms of how they perceive managing a particular region over time. I like to say that this is an idea whose time has come. And again, this is a quote from Victor Hugo. I live in Paris, so I try to use French philosophers to guide my life. And this is one that I think is particularly appropriate, and again, I emphasize that it's no longer a concept, it's actually a practice in many places. Marine spatial planning has many different kinds of characteristics. We like to talk about performing or carrying out ecosystem-based management. But there's a great deal of confusion also about what does that mean, and how do we actually define what an ecosystem is, let alone manage it. So I think that this is, marine spatial planning is one approach that gets us closer. It doesn't take us all the way to ecosystem-based management, but certainly allows us to move in the right direction. It's integrated, and John has stressed the idea of integration, I think, adequately, and participatory as well. It can only succeed if there are stakeholders involved in the development of a planning process. It has to be adaptive, and again, John mentioned that. You have to be able to learn over time and to do things better the next time that you do them. The next one is sort of strange that you have to define marine spatial planning as being strategic and future-oriented, but that's the case. Many planning activities today simply document what we're doing currently. And the marine spatial planning, the emphasis of marine spatial planning, is on planning, but planning for the future. That's the real purpose of planning. And finally, very importantly, just as John described work in the Great Barrier Reef, marine spatial planning is place-based by its fundamental nature. It takes place in places that people can relate to, whether it's the Georges Bank off the coast of New England, whether it's one of your large areas here in Costa Rica, or whether it's the entire exclusive economic zone of a particular country. As importantly, it's a continuing process. It is not a master plan. We used to do planning by developing a master plan that supposedly would lay out the future of a particular area forever. It would never change. It would be the prescription or the blueprint or the master plan for the future. We don't do planning that way anymore. We do planning by learning through an adaptive process. And again, no matter what your time frame is for developing a spatial plan, it is only the first step in the process. It has to be conceptualized and implemented as a continuing process. Now again, I said that this is no longer an academic idea. 10 years ago it was. Certainly 30 years ago, when the Great Barrier Reef was involved in doing some of the first zoning and place-based management, the rest of the world, this was just an idea. But today, there are about somewhere between 16 and 18 countries that are actually undertaking marine spatial planning. There are about 65 spatial plans in various stages of development. And some countries, such as the three that are in the upper left-hand part of this list, have in fact implemented spatial planning at least once, if not twice. So they're going through, in some cases, a second and third generation of spatial planning. So I want to try to describe, and again, some of these points have been made already, but why do we even need something called marine spatial planning? And as I go through this presentation, I want you to remember one thing, that spatial planning, marine spatial planning, is not the end. We could have the best planning system in the world in place, but it might not do anything, or it might be doing the wrong thing. So the outcomes of the process are really what is important, not the means, marine spatial planning itself. But I think we know from a number of studies that have been printed recently that there's no area of the ocean today that is untouched by human activities. And there are various reasons why this is occurring. A lot of these activities are just traditional uses and users of the ocean. Fishing would be an obvious one, but there are new uses that are coming along, such as marine recreation. Technological change is driving a great deal of what we are seeing happen in the ocean and why we need marine spatial planning. There are new demands for ocean space, particularly with respect to offshore renewable resources in many places. And there are new demands in places that we haven't thought about before as being open for development, such as the Arctic. Now, what's the nature of this problem? This is an interesting study that was done by a university in Belgium about 7 or 8 years ago, when the minister who was responsible for the offshore area, the exclusive economic zone of Belgium, relatively small area, looked at the amount of rights that had already been granted to users of that space, who had the rights to space for fishing, for marine transportation, for sand and gravel mining, etc. The interesting conclusion of that study was that, in fact, if you carried out, if someone really exercised all of the rights that had already been granted, you would need basically 2.5 Belgiums to accommodate all of those rights. 264% of the Belgian EEZ had already been allocated. And he was also asked to find space for offshore renewable resources. They were not on that diagram. He was also asked by the European Union to identify new protected areas in the marine environment. So where do you find space for renewable resources and nature protection if you've already allocated 2.5 times what you have? So he quickly realized that he had a problem. And in fact, this is what the problem looked like when they mapped out some of these activities. There are considerable conflicts in terms of the use of space in not only the Belgian EEZ, but similar studies have been done around the UK, in many countries of Western Europe. There are two ways to manage marine space, two ways to manage a lot of space. One is an incremental approach, and this is basically what we do today. We allocate space basically one economic sector at a time, piece by piece. There's little or no coordination across the government agencies that are carrying out these kinds of responsibilities. There's no coordination among levels of government, and again, John has already said a number of those things. The alternative to that is to do it in a more integrated or comprehensive way. This is what marine spatial planning is about, where we try to integrate across economic sectors, across government agencies, etc. This is what it looks like diagrammatically. Again, we manage in terms of silos. Fisheries is managed as one use, again with very little consideration about what's going on across other uses. Marine transportation, even marine protected areas, are typically managed on a silo basis, sector by sector. The result of that is that we carry out zoning. We in fact do allocate space in the marine environment. This is a